My name is Bashir Fancy. I'm the Chairman and CEO for the Canadian Information Processing Society National Board, and I'm also President of Ontario. We are very fortunate, actually it's a privilege to have Neil Beaton today from CASL, who is actually going to speak to us about CASL Storm. And to put it in plain language, as everybody knows, the Canadian anti-spam legislation came into being last year, and it's gone through some changes that will come into force in July next year. But what we are finding out that not everybody is either fully aware, or if they are aware, they're not fully prepared. And one of the fortunate things for us is Neil Beaton, so he's going to walk us through. So very quickly, and you will see why he's well placed to speak on this subject, because I think they're the only people who actually have a solution for this. And more importantly than that's a CRTC view, so that's a good thing. So let me tell you a little bit about Neil. He has actually got over 20 years of experience in IT and high-tech engineering, project management, as well as new business development in a number of industries. That involve number of industries. He's also responsible for development of new business initiative for CASL, which is Canadian anti-spam legislation, and at CASL, of course, that's what they deal with, as well as subsidiaries of OTC, CASL, Cure's parent company. He was previously the Senior Vice President and CIO with Pacific Western Bank of Canada. I'm sure a lot of people know, I certainly know who they are, where he developed two entirely new lines of business for the bank, one each for lending and deposits side of the business, which is actually quite interesting, because they are now become bigger because of the mergers and whatever. So and prior to that, he was the project director for numerous local and global ERP setups and large IT implementation for various multinational corporations, including Rolls-Royce Canada, CAE, and L3 Communications. So in short, he's got pretty solid background, and he's going to walk us through. So I don't want to take up time, because you come to really hear from him all the expertise. So I'm going to move that to him in the next 2 seconds here. And I will now hand it to Neil. So take it away, Neil. All the very best here. Let me actually share the camera for a second. I had stopped. So in case you're wondering, oops, who Neil is, that's Neil, and I'm only going to get out of the scene in a second. So there we go. Now I can do that, so you can take it away. There we go.
All right, well, thanks very much, Bashir. Thanks everybody for attending. Very pleased to be able to be invited to this forum and talk to you a little bit about CASL, Canadian anti-spam legislation. As Bashir mentioned, it's a law that's been in place for a couple of years now. It was first implemented in 2014, July of 2014, but there are some fairly significant things that are coming in the next, specifically in the next year, in 2017, and that's sort of what I'd like to talk to you about. So just give you a little bit of background on what the law is, where it's come from, where we're at, and where it's going to, and what that means for you in terms of being prepared from a risk management standpoint. Okay, so just a little level set on CASL itself. It's a federal statute applying all across Canada. It focuses on commercial electronic messages. So the very first thing a lot of people don't understand or know about it is that it doesn't refer to spam in the generic sense that people most think of spam. It doesn't matter if it's a message one-to-one, one-to-many, B2B, B2C. The definition really focuses on the nature of a commercial electronic message. So if there's any email that's being sent externally outside of your business that has any sort of commercial angle to it whatsoever, it falls under CASL. In fact, the very first company that was fined by the CRTC back in 2014 when the law kicked off was a company called CompuFinder, and they were a B2B. So it's not necessarily what people first think of when they think of spam. It encompasses a whole lot more. So it doesn't just apply to bulk email, it's all commercial email. So what does it mean? It's probably the most significant anti-spam legislation in the world. Most industrialized countries have some form of anti-spam legislation. South of the border, they've got CAN spam. Honestly, this law, from my perspective, is overkill. It's got a lot of complications, and you're going to see as we go through it, ultimately very, very difficult to be compliant with. The U.S. took a simpler approach. Their CAN spam law basically says you can email anybody anytime unless they ask you not to. So their approach is an opt-out approach. So they just say that any email has to give the recipient the opportunity to unsubscribe or opt out. Canada's, as you'll see, has a whole nother level of complication where it's called opt-in, where you have to have consent in advance. And that's a fundamental difference, and it's something that makes us the most difficult anti-spam legislation to comply with. The CRTC is the regulator. They've been very aggressive in their pursuit of offside companies. However, one of the things that, a theme that you'll see in this whole presentation is there's a whole evolution of the law that's coming next year that is completely unique and adds a whole nother level of risk. And that's in July of 2017 on the 3rd anniversary. The CRTC isn't going away. They're going to stay in the regulatory capacity, but there's a whole nother parallel track that's being added, which is called private right to action or private right of action. You see both. But basically what it means is individuals can now sue you on an email by email basis for non-compliant emails. And those lawsuits are also eligible for rolling up into class action litigation. So it's a fairly significant change to the law. And certainly as the law has evolved, companies are looking at revising their strategies and solutions because this adds a whole nother risk profile. And the nature of CASL being fundamentally focused on email, but it actually covers all commercial messages, so it hits text as well, hits BBM, it actually hits software updates too. Any sort of commercial message that is pushed out that doesn't have consent is offside. And you also have to have a couple other things that we'll get to in a minute. But because of that, and because it hits email, which is fundamental to business basically, for any company, the impact of compliance or non-compliance, depending on which way you look at it, is going to hit IT, it's going to hit HR, it's going to hit marketing, and then some combination of legal, compliance, and risk are combined, accountable, and then ultimately senior management is accountable as well. So it's quite pervasive. Now, after saying how hard it is to comply with, I can actually say it's relatively easy to describe. It's just what it means in practice that's very, very difficult. CASL fundamentally requires three simple to describe things. First, as I mentioned before, you need consent in advance. There's a couple of types of consent. Express consent would be somebody saying, yes, Neil, please email me your information. I give you consent to email me and contact me. There's a whole bunch of other implied consents that are related to different types of relationships. The most common of which would be an existing commercial relationship. So if you're doing business with somebody or another company, there's an implied consent that you are going to be able to contact them by email because you're doing business with them. That implied consent is constantly renewed for a 2-year period every time you have a commercial transaction. So if you're in a frequent transaction business, that implied consent is going to constantly get renewed. But if you're in an infrequent transaction business like insurance or something like that, this is something that you need to pay close attention to. Because every 2 years, if you haven't had a commercial transaction, it expires. And you can't email somebody to ask them for consent because the fact of emailing them is breaking the law. So you have to get your consent some other way. There's a number of other different types of implied consent. If you're referred by somebody, that is a one-time use consent. So if somebody refers me to a third party and that third party doesn't respond, that's it, the consent's gone. I need to contact them some other way, by phone or some other method. I can't email them again. If they've responded, that opens up the implied consent. If somebody contacts me and asks me about my business, that has a 6-month window of implied consent because they've initiated the conversation. And then I have 6 months to either secure them as a client, get their express consent, or whatever. So Getting consent is a simple thing to say. Managing all of those different types of consent is extremely complicated. And the law specifically states it's the responsibility of the sender to acquire consent, but also prove and track consent. So you need to keep track of those different implied consents and the timeframes. The other two things it requires is proper identification. So the fact of an email address isn't proper identification. You need to say the name of your company and some other contact information like your address and phone number or something that is not an email. So that's proper corporate identification. And then additionally, you have to have a built-in unsubscribe mechanism, which is the other thing that the US says is all you need. We say you have to have that as well. So you have to give anybody that you ever send an email to the option to unsubscribe at any point in time. So it's not just a question of consent. Anybody that you're emailing has to have their corporate ID, and the unsubscribe is required. And per the CRTC, which has basically been setting case law for the last 3 years in the different pursuits and fines that it's levied, there is no gray area in compliance. You're either compliant or you're not. So you can see where what the impacts are. There's a number of consequences of non-compliance. The CRTC wields some pretty big sticks. I already mentioned their very first fine that they hit with CompuFinder was $1 million back in 2014. Officers and directors as individuals are liable up to $1 million each, and a company up to $10 million. So that's the CRTC track. Starting July of next year, a whole nother parallel track emerges. As I said, the CRTC is not going away. They're going to stay in the regulatory capacity, but the law evolves in a way that the CRTC designed such that the market will regulate this whole law. And that's the private right of action. Damages are assumed. It's open for class action as well. And the suits can go from $200 per individual email per recipient up to $1 million a day, which is basically the equivalent of 5,000 offsite emails. So if you're sending a bulk email campaign that's non-compliant, that campaign can be liable for up to 5,000 emails, but that's a daily exposure. So it can be very extensive very quickly. This is just a quick snapshot. I actually pulled this image off of the CRTC presentation that they did. They've got a number of individuals that are constantly out in the market talking about the law. And this is just a very simple high level. I'm not going to read everything on here. But basically, this is the cycle that they go through in the way that they approach this. So the initial thing is communication, promoting compliance. They want to help companies get in compliance and warn them about it. They had a whole lead up. There was a grace period, but we're well beyond all of that now. We're 3 years in, and with a significant evolution coming in July of next year. So they promote compliance, then they monitor it. They've got a number of different ways of doing that. In the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of complaints that they've had since this law came into place, they investigate the non-compliance, and then they prosecute as well by responding to non-compliance. And there's a number of different things that they can do there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is the way that they see their role from a regulatory standpoint. This is probably one of the most important slides for the presentation, because as I said, the definition of the law is pretty easy. You need consent, you need an unsubscribe, and you need corporate ID. But making that happen for even a small organization is difficult, and if you get any complexity to your organization whatsoever, it gets really, really difficult. So when you start looking at multiple facilities, multiple divisions, all the sources and uses of emails in all the different databases, the Outlook databases, the CRM databases, the marketing database, the bulk email database, any source and use of email addresses, when you look at all of those, you've got to be able to ensure that you're tracking and can prove consent for all of those emails that might be sent to those recipients, and you need to manage the unsubscribes when one of those recipients says, hey, stop sending me emails. And depending on how your unsubscribe works, that may be a request to unsubscribe from an individual or the whole company or something in between. But the answer is, whatever they unsubscribe from, you need to be able to honor that, and across the board. And when you add those levels of complexity, it gets very complicated. The fact of mobile devices adds a whole nother level of complications when you think of smartphones and tablets and laptops. An example I use quite commonly, and I'm sure everybody's had the same experience, is I get emails every single day where at the bottom of the email it says sent from my BlackBerry, sent from my iPhone, whatever. That's those companies' built-in marketing. You as a user actually have to go into the device on a device-by-device basis and change that footer to read sent from Neil Beaton, CASL, London, Ontario, with the proper corporate identification. So of the three tenets of the law, you would think corporate ID would be the easiest one to meet. But by that example alone, every one of those emails that's sent by somebody that doesn't have that footer built in with the proper corporate identification, and if they don't have an email signature built in that could do the same thing, and I can't count how many emails I get of those every day, every one of those is offside. So the CRTC clearly isn't going to be able to digest all of that. They're overwhelmed as it is. But once this opens up to private right to action, every one of those is $200, and it's black and white. Corporate ID missing, there's no question of unsubscribe or consent. That one piece alone makes those offside. Tracking consent and unsubscribe with mobile stuff is a whole nother level of complication. So you can see now, these are the reasons why complying with a relatively simple to define law is very, very, very hard to do in practice. And then you add the dynamics of business changing and new customers coming and vendors coming and emails changing and all of that. It gets very, very hard to track. So legal compliance risk typically take the lead, although I've seen companies where IT's owned it, that's not uncommon. I've seen marketing on it, which in most cases I would think is unusual, but I've seen some significant companies where marketing is responsible for compliance with this law. It's entirely up to the company how they manage it, but it always impacts legal compliance risk, IT, marketing, and HR to an extent as well. There's significant costs associated with trying to manage all of these variables, because typically there's some sort of manual intervention, and maintaining, tracking, and updating the consents and unsubscribes almost always is going to leave some significant gaps in compliance. When you look at a situation where the CRTC actually undertakes, they actually call it an undertaking, and they put a company through the process that results in a fine, the fine is the last piece in the puzzle. It's also typically the smallest piece. The process is months and months and months, and it involves external legal, it involves internal legal for the company that's going under the undertaking with the CRTC. Management costs, IT costs, costs of compliance, reporting, monitoring, everything that the CRTC enforces as they put you through that process. And then there's also a reputational risk. If you get wind up with a fine in the end, you're in the headlines and people know that you're one of the ones that got caught for spamming, and that's generally frowned upon. But when you look at all of those costs, I've talked to a number of people that are very close to these things from a legal perspective. Those costs in aggregate are typically 10 to 1 over the fine. So if you look at Rogers, I used $200,000 here, that's the fine they got hit with last year. Their total costs for everything else that I just summarized in the last slide would have been conservatively estimated at about $2 million. So they spent that and then wound up with a $2 million fine on top of it. So there's significant cost and exposure going through the CRTC process. Going through an investigation might not result in a fine. And at any point in time, the CRTC's got somewhere between 50 and 75 companies. That's about, I think, what the maximum they can look at any point in time with all the resources, and it always drags out over months and months and months. But for the same reason, even if that company doesn't result in a fine, the fact of them being investigated and going through that process and having to respond legally and management and IT and everything that they do, the average cost is about $500,000. And, yeah, to the company. For the same reason, all of those other costs that I sort of highlighted in the last slide, it all adds up very quickly. And then again, this is, you're getting the theme here. The CRTC in and of itself has been active in the market for 3 years, but realistically, it's been a handful of fines, some of them high profile, and we're going to look at some of the cases here and talk about them and why it happened and how it happened. But next year, a whole nother element of risk and cost opens up with the private right to action or private right of action. And again, we've covered the costs, 200 in email, up to $1 million a day. So I mentioned the CRTC has been spending a significant amount of resource on communication. This is a direct quote from the chairman meeting with 1,800 representatives nationally from the CMA this May. You can read it yourself, but this is straight out of his dialogue, his presentation. You can understand why people are nervous. Once the private right of action comes, I won't be able to help you. You're on your own, and good luck with that. All the more reason to get in compliance, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom line is, they planned this, they're doing it for a reason, it's coming. They have their track's not going away, but this parallel one is huge and way bigger and a whole lot more risk as far as companies are concerned. This is just a silly little comic about the risk of trying to do things manually, which a lot of companies are stuck doing, because doing it in a fully automated and integrated fashion is ridiculously complicated. It's really, really, really hard to do. And not a lot of companies have the IT resources to assign to this, to say, fix this problem, and by the way, make sure you fix it in all instances for all databases, for all platforms, for all divisions, for all dispersed sales forces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, very, very hard to do. Which brings me to the human involvement thing, which is happening more often than not as companies try to struggle to get in compliance since 2014, and is what they're looking at going forward in 2017 next year. When you look at manual involvement in the planning, the auditing, the updates, the tracking, data entry, et cetera, you're opening up yourself for all sorts of potential errors, omissions, you name it, gaps. Third bullet is a very real risk, especially next year. A disgruntled employee next year can start sending some very, very, very expensive emails. So it's not something to not pay attention to. It requires companies' focus to make sure that they're doing everything that they need to do to be in compliance, and it's not easy to do. And certainly, whatever you can do to automate and integrate the process is obviously going to help that. So as I mentioned, I'd take a quick look at some of the companies that have been hit by the CRTC. These are a couple of more high-profile ones. So last year, Porter was hit, and Porter actually had, as they thought, acted in good faith to comply with the law. They thought they were doing what they needed to do to comply with the law. As it turns out, they had some significant gaps in both their unsubscribe and consent tracking mechanisms, and they wound up with a $150,000 fine, but also a protracted, expensive $1.5 million or more process to arrive at that $150,000 fine. Rogers was another fairly high-profile one from last year. Theirs was exclusively on the back of the unsubscribe mechanism. And the unsubscribe is actually pretty hard to do for a bunch of reasons. It needs to do three things. The first one is fairly self-evident. It's got to work, and it's got to work all the time. But when you look at all the complicating variables, you understand very quickly why it's hard to make it work all the time. So that's the first thing, and theirs didn't. And then the other thing, two things it needs to do, is it needs to be available for a recipient to act on for 60 days after you've sent the email. So for 2 months after you press send on an email, the recipient should be able to, at any point in those 2 months, say, yeah, I've changed my mind, I don't want to hear from you anymore, or whatever. And then if they select the unsubscribe option, that actually needs to be honored within 10 business days. So again, the CRTC recognizes that a lot of companies won't have the wherewithal to completely automate and integrate that to make it happen instantly. So they give it 10 business days for you to do whatever you need to do to go through all your systems to make sure that that unsubscribe is honored wherever that email might reside. Rogers fell down on all 3 counts, $200,000 fine and a couple million in costs. The most recent, just a month ago now, was Kellogg, and they actually voluntarily entered into the undertaking. They ended up with the smallest fine, I think, because they voluntarily went into it. A lot of this isn't publicly published, just the generalities are, but you can read into it that they said they knew they had a problem, so they got hit with a fine, but it was on the very small end. And it was because of them or a third party, which in my view means a third party, was sending emails. So they had a provider, I don't know who it is, but just to give an example, like a MailChimp or like a Constant Contact or somebody like that, or a CRM system that was providing a service to send the emails, the consent wasn't properly tracked and monitored, and so they got hit. They recognized that they might have a problem, said take a look at us, and got the fine. The problem was back in October to December of 2014. The fine just came out a month ago. So you can imagine how much time and effort and cost was spent going through that process, which just illustrates what I was saying before. There's a huge, under the 9/10 of the iceberg of cost is not the fine itself, it's what it takes to go through it.
Here's the question, we talked about third party, so you're using the parent company, using third party, based on the fact, the same one, third party itself, you're responsible for third party and their actions?
Yeah,
Can you repeat the question because you're close to the mic?
Sure. So there was a question here from inside the room. Basically, the question was, when you are a parent company, or if you're Kellogg and you're using a third party, that it's Kellogg's responsibility to have the consent for the sending of those emails. I'm not a lawyer and can't give you direct legal advice. No, but I have to say that as a disclaimer. But knowing what I know about the law, the first thing is you'd have to understand what the terms and conditions are between the two. But typically the terms and conditions are very clearly stated, like the MailChimps and Constant Contacts. And again, in my experience, they will manage unsubscribes and corporate ID within their funnel, and they will send emails to ones that you say you've got consent for. So it's the parent company. There could be contracts where those terms and conditions are different, but I would say 99% of the time that's the case.
The reason why I'm saying that is, I'm also looking at not just MailChimp, I'm also looking at when you're doing research and you're asking people to come in and do test products and test their services and so forth. And you're using third party to do those actions for a marketing perspective.
Yeah, again, so the question was from a marketing perspective, if you've got third parties coming in and they're doing research and studies and interacting with people outside your company, again, my understanding is the onus is on the parent company to have that consent, because they're acting on your behalf effectively, right?
Based on the term and conditions that you create.
Yeah, so conceivably a term and condition could supersede that, but I would expect typically they wouldn't.
So the expectation then is going to be for companies to look at the conditions and their agreements they have
Yeah.
with their vendors and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this case, Kellogg was responsible, and they got the fine, but because they were voluntary, it's a relatively small fine. But you can be sure that was a painful, protracted, expensive process to go through. So this is just an infrastructure solution overview, and this is stuff that the CRTC in a number, I've parsed this down. I've seen a lot of the presentations and things that they put out to industry, and these are themes that they are strongly recommending every time they go out there. So first, they expect a senior executive to champion the creation and implementation of the compliance model. That same senior executive or another one, whatever, supervises compliance in response to potential breaches. So the compliance officer is not uncommon. That's that person. Then, of course, HR always has a role with employees' handbooks, policies, procedures, all of that sort of stuff. Along with that, they expect initial training, staff, directors, management, and then, of course, new hires and all that sort of thing on an ongoing basis. People need to be trained. It's all part of the overall compliance model. They recommend annual testing. Again, that's typical audit protocol. They want to see a technology model that's been architected to achieve all the business goals set out in it. So again, the business goals being that you've got consent in advance, that you can track and prove you've got that consent, and that you're honoring you're honoring an unsubscribe at all times, and that the rules around it are honored at all times, the 60-day availability and the 10 days from the request to honoring it. And then they also, again, the standard audit type stuff, recommend initial and ongoing stress testing of the system to ensure that you don't have holes anywhere.
So my point would be that internal audit should in fact be a key player in this to review, provide validation, make sure that people are doing this thing, right?
Yeah, typically there's not typically, commonly, there is a CASL compliance officer, and that officer will have the mandate to run that sort of thing, and depending on the size of the organization, they might have an audit team that focuses on a lot of different things, CASL being one of them. But yes, that would be a typical approach, definitely.
Good way to do it.
Absolutely.
So, in that situation, sorry.
No.
So in that situation, basically what example you gave was when Kellogg and so forth, I'm actually kind of shocked that CRTC hasn't mentioned anything about vendor management.
Of vendor?
Vendor management.
Oh, no. Yeah,
Because
very good.
looking at this perspective, and we're talking about March, talking about the senior executives, are talking about working with HR, which are great things, but a lot of the other bigger companies also use it as vendors, essentially third parties.
Yeah.
And I'm just from CRTC's perspective, CRTC,
Sure.
I'm surprised they haven't even called that out.
Well, I've distilled this down. I've seen a lot of presentations with a lot of stuff,
Yeah.
and that's come up as questions, and typically it's answered sort of the way that I mentioned with the
Yeah.
T's and C's. You need to know those depending on the situation, but that it's typically the sender, the owner, the principal's responsibility to have the consent to track it.
So the question is really about vendor management, that
Yeah.
when, and did you also mean like if somebody's outsourced to third party?
Oh, yeah.
Effectively, you don't outsource responsibilities, you're still on the hook,
Yeah.
right? So unless you have tight agreements and people are trained and understand, you're asking for trouble. So this is actually much broader.
Yeah, but
Uh,
it's
in-
also on point for the the vendor, is that they need to raise these because if something happens, you're going to get into, let's use the equivalent of often a pissing contest between, the parent company and the vendor, exchanging barb over whose responsibility is it? And it could be like the vendor is completely innocent. They've got to spend all this thing, defending themselves when they haven't done anything wrong.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm not sure how clear that was, but the point being made was that the vendors should be aware, definitely, that they have a responsibility or should have a responsibility to ensure that their agreements clearly state where the responsibility lies for consent tracking, unsubscribe mechanisms, and corporate ID.
To continue on what Jim was saying as well, I agree that the parent company, the company itself, should own the responsibility. But when you're outsourcing to a vendor, that you outsource to another vendor, because you're dealing with multiple situations, because you have a vendor that says, okay, you want me to hit these multiple channels, telephone, internet, so forth, we're going to be using other third-party companies that are contracted to us to do that service.
Yep.
And so, truth be told, the person who's like, or the company itself, will be having that contract with that vendor, and I'm expecting that vendor to make sure that you have the corporate due diligence from the other people that they're using to provide the service to you.
Yep, absolutely.
Because it's like a domino effect of the points that we're going to hierarchy, unfortunately, right?
Yep.
So as Bashir was saying, it is a very broad perspective as we're looking at it. It's a little bit concerning when we're learning a lot more about the impacts it's having, because the domino effect of it is pretty high.
Yep. And you can imagine the users out there, they're the users, the general population, there's going to be a subset of that general population that's going to make try to make a side living or a full living off of this stuff. With the volume of spam that's out there at $200 a pop, with a lot of this being very clearly black and white, there's going to be that level of activity. And then I know personally for sure, because I've been dealing with this law for a number of years now and dealing with a lot of the legal side of it, there's a whole lot of law firms that cannot wait until July of next year, and they've got a whole practice lined up for this. So it's going to be significant. So that sort of wraps up the bulk of my presentation. We've had some internal questions. Bashir, I think you've got some ways of monitoring to see if external questions have come, but just in advance of that, my contact information is here. You can see I'm giving you my express consent to email me should you choose to, and you have that in writing, this thing's being recorded, so you've got all the proof you're going to need. But I'll let Bashir sort of take over here and see if we've got some questions.
Okay, we're going to open up even the webcam so that people can see you as well. And All right, so one way you guys can actually put your questions in is, let me go to the question side of things. Okay, and pull it out. Where is the question? There. Okay, so if on each of your thing you will see there is a way to ask the questions. So if you can do that, that would be fabulous.
I've got a question while we wait. It comes back to, I guess, the requirement on the CASL for the unsubscribe. How is that intended to be managed on one-to-one emails with a certain contact at a company? Like, you're not going to want to put in your signature to unsubscribe. Like, there's nothing.
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways you can slice that. Typically, the most basic approach to an unsubscribe mechanism. I'll just repeat the question. I'm not sure how well it's being transmitted. The question was from inside the room here. How do you manage the definition of your unsubscribe, and what sort of information and how many options do you include there? So I was just starting to answer the question in the typical, most basic type of unsubscribe would give the recipient the option to unsubscribe from you as a sender. So they would say, in my case, Neil, stop sending me emails, please. I don't want any emails more from you for whatever reason. They don't have to give a reason, just it's done. And then the second option is, I don't want to hear any more from CASL Cure as a company, period, or whatever the company. So there's an individual level unsubscribe and a corporate level unsubscribe. And so that would be a typical basic approach. And there's a lot of ways that you can have that happen. You can have a web-based interface that they press an unsubscribe link, and that opens up a browser that gives you those options. And if you've got that sort of approach, you can add different levels to it. So you could also, say a large organization might say, unsubscribe from the sender, unsubscribe from the organization, unsubscribe from the newsletter, unsubscribe from marketing materials or sales, advertising. So you could do it by sort of division, that sort of thing. A good example would be a bank. You could unsubscribe from personal banking versus commercial banking versus investments, all of that sort of thing. So complicated as you like, it's up to the company to define it. And the bigger companies usually try to define it in a more granular fashion so that it's not an all or nothing, right? But that's another level of complication.
What I was getting at is that you and I are conducting your business, and expected to have in our signature line of all our communication, whether it's you or me, the saying an unsubscribe. Like right now, you've got Neil with your contact information and any other other information that you have, not the same thing. Are we both expected to now have a unsubscribe option in our signature line?
Yeah, the answer is yes. How you do that is.
So the question was what? For them?
Yeah, sorry, just to repeat the question was, if you're corresponding with somebody that you're doing business with and you've got a volume of back and forth correspondence, does each correspondence have to have the corporate ID and the unsubscribe? And the answer is yes. Now, how that happens, because they need to be able to at any point in time. So there's different ways that you can build that in with different levels of sophistication and complexity. But the short answer is, at any point in time, they need to know who the sender is, and they need to have the option to opt out, always.
Okay, so we have 3 questions from the audience. The first one is basically saying, I didn't realize from David how big a deal CASL is, so thank you for the information. You're very welcome, David. It's exactly what was intended. Second question is from Sean, and what Sean is asking is, has there, with such a wide scope, will CRTC be able to enforce, and will there be any pushback from the business community? Are you aware of any pushback to CRTC, or that's done, or still to come, or?
Well, the answer to the first question is July 2017. So clearly the CRTC is overwhelmed. They sort of anticipated that, but they did have included grace periods with, and I didn't get into all the complexity of that because it's behind us, but they did give companies grace period to get in on site and but they are a relatively small group, and they've got a massive hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of complaints, and that's what they're trying to digest. At any point in time, as I mentioned, they got 50 to 75 companies that they're looking at, which is not a small number, but in the grand scheme of Canada is a relatively small percentage, and they've actually doled out a half a dozen fines. So the answer is no, they can't cope with the whole thing, and they expected that, and so they're looking to the market to regulate it in 2017 by opening up the private right of action. That's precisely what they're doing. And in terms of pushback from the business community, I don't have any direct first-hand knowledge from the CRTC to say, you know, yes, experientially, but notionally, I know just in dealing with the business community in this capacity for years now, yes, a lot of companies think it's an onerous law, it's a difficult law, it's a complicated law, and it's expensive. And the answer to all of those is yes, but it's a law, and it's not going to
push back at the start. I know they went and made changes and so forth, that we are now at the stage where I don't think they're going to accommodate too much if they're pushing so hard.
Well, I can actually speak to that for a minute, what they're doing. So again, I won't go through the stages they went through, but you're absolutely right. There was a lead up to the law being enacted, and then there was a grace period once it was enacted. But the next thing that's coming is, starting in July next year, a 3-year clock will start where they will open it up for review. And they're going to have some active review of that, and I'm sure that'll involve business feedback, and I'm sure it'll involve feedback from the private right of action, which is going to be a whole nother. Means is there will be no, as my understanding of it is, there will be no substantive changes to the law until 2020. So at the very least, there's a 3-year window where private right of action and the current status quo with CRTC in parallel will be what's happening. And companies will be dealing with that in that capacity for 3 years. And that in 2020, there will be an opportunity to make some changes should they choose to do so.
So, okay, there's another question here. I'll just take that and come back to you. So the question from Lucien is, what automation solutions have successfully been implemented to address the procedural challenges brought on by CASL, now given the fact that you have described it?
So my parent company is called OTC Group, and we've got a subsidiary that we created and designed a solution for CASL, which is how I got to know about this law. I've been participating in it it's been about 4 years now, in designing a solution and implementing a solution that we built. So we have, to my knowledge, and I've shown our product to the CRTC, earlier this year, the Director of Enforcement and the Senior Industry Liaison Officer, both of whom weren't really aware of our product until I met with them almost a year, or earlier this year at the very beginning of the year, to show them our fully automated and integrated solution. And they were extremely impressed by it. They didn't realize that solution existed. They now do, although they're not in the business of endorsing solutions. They're just a regulator, and they take a very narrow view of that. But in my dealings with the industry and with them over the past number of years, we have the only fully automated and integrated solution, and it's patented in Canada and the US, and actually satisfies CAN, SPAM, and CASL at the same time in the same deployment with different rules if need be. It's a pretty slick solution. So my contact information is at the end of the presentation. I'd be more than happy to set a meeting to do face-to-face or a webinar or whatever to explain exactly how our system works and how we do manage all the complexities in every case, in every instance, to satisfy compliance with the law.
Hopefully that answered your question, Lucien and Sean. Any other question? You had a question here, so we have one question here Andrew.
In regards to CASL, in regards to the CRTC, I know the regulators are now kind of going to a perspective of being more interactive and having people some report on any obligations. Is there a perspective from the CRTC that they're looking for some perspective for CASL in the future?
Again, my understanding is, sorry, yeah, I'll repeat the question. So regulatory bodies in general, the point was being made that a lot of regulatory bodies is the CRTC doing this. I think the Kellogg example is a perfect example of that. They actually did that. It was self-reported to they voluntarily went into the undertaking. And certainly, again, got a fine and had to go through the process of getting into compliance and figuring out where the problems were, which appears to have taken about 2 years, which is not insignificant. But if you go back to the quote from the chairman, his endorsement and encouragement was, we want to help you get into compliance as soon as possible, because once private right of action comes, they can't help you. But they are doing very active road shows to, like the CMA was just one, between the chairman, the director of enforcement, and the senior industry liaison officer, 3 people that I don't know the chairman personally, but I know the other 2. They spend a significant amount of their time interacting with business on a fairly large scale from an educational standpoint. And in their continuum that I showed you, that was the first piece. So they would actively endorse it for sure. Now, how many companies actually do that? I don't know.
So here's an interesting question. We know that depending on whatever compliance requirement come out, some people will try to find a way around it, right? If they can't do it or whatever. There's always, unfortunately, some guys who try that. So here's the question. We know that when it came to the telephone and all that, that they actually sold the lists overseas and the calls are coming in. How do they get caught in this net? Are you aware? Like if they have sold the list or they're getting emails coming from outside?
Yeah, so clearly one of the issues with the law is that probably more the lion's share of spam comes from outside of Canada,
right.
In terms of pure volume and the traditional sense of spam, beyond the commercial electronic message, which is actually the broader definition that they've brought this in. But when people hear the word spam, they think of that's what you're talking about.
That's good.
And again, from the CRTC standpoint, my understanding is their approach, they've got a number of different levels to the approach. The very first one would be that if the spamming company has a footprint in Canada, they will, if you've got 25 divisions worldwide and one of them's in Canada and spam is coming into Canada from the head office or one of the other divisions of the head office, they'll go after the local. So that's one. Number 2, I've heard, again, from not directly, but through people that are familiar with the CRTC and what they've been doing, is that they've gotten into discussions with the IRS to look at ways that they could mutually support each other through CASL and CAN-SPAM and to bring something to bear to this situation. I still think you're dropping the bucket in the global traditional spam market. So CASL is really, in the short term, being enforced locally, but there are multinational companies, and I'm dealing with them myself, US operations that have examples of what I just said, one operation in Canada and dozens elsewhere, but that one operation in Canada is making them pay attention to this law as well as CAN-SPAM, and in our case, we've got a solution that covers it all.
And this actually strictly is dealing with only the emails or phone calls and stuff like that? Or
well, phone doesn't fall into this. That's a whole other thing.
Right.
The do not call, that's a whole other
exactly.
regulatory item. Under CASL, email is what my current solution deals with. That is the broadest thing that most companies are concerned with, and that's been the primary focus of the CRTC. But that said, they've already pursued a couple of software ones. So I mentioned software updates. It's any electronic message, and they view that as an electronic message. There's also texts, BBMs, that sort of thing. We have a text solution, which is a totally different platform, a totally different technology, and a totally different solution that is under development, and we'll be launching that in Q1 2017. But from my perspective, our focus has been on email, and I think the industry largely has been focused on email.
Okay, Fred Lee has a question. What if the company is outside of Canada, which is kind of...
Yeah, I think he probably typed that while I was talking, but the answer is that they'll go after them in terms of their presence in Canada, and I know at a higher level with a longer view, there's
So for now, their hands are tied unless there is a government-to-government agreement, as you were saying. Like we know that some of the stuff comes from like Far East and so forth. Meaning probably India is a big one, but not just them, to be fair, even South America and places like that. So the question is, for now, they may get away, but not really. They're conducting work for like duck guys, right? Where every, second call or third call. So they are obviously getting the business to effectively do the business here. So they could go with those companies who end up with the business. They must have an agreement.
It depends on the, exactly.
Right?
Could be.
They must have an agreement. Why else the guys who are calling from outside and I end up with a business here, that means I have some sort of agreement. It's just that I'm using these guys outside. So CRTC by extension could actually extrapolate and think, no, you are involved because you are getting the business, right? So they could really, right?
Because, a lot of these spams is for a Canadian, company, or I don't know, maybe that's wrong, but a lot of these electronic messages, these bulk things are for some, Canadian product or service, but because it's cheaper to have it managed, overseas, so I guess, it's going to start affecting those,
Absolutely, but I'd say the fundamental message here is because the audience that we're talking to right here, right now, my understanding is it's pretty much locally based organizations that have a presence in Canada at the very least, if not completely, is that CRTC is there, they're not going away. They're in your risk profile, and the odds of you getting under the microscope, relatively speaking, low, but not going away. But the private right of action is opening up a vastly wider swath of potential risk.
And to your question, what point you're making is, what if the cloud is outside somewhere, right? But based on what we're hearing, and it makes logical sense, it doesn't. And so they will have to be very careful in dealing with. Okay, that's makes
my
sense.
concern is making sure you've got in your one-to-one your communication, that you've got a proper, because I can just see, you don't have that thing, someone's going to, if you accidentally, email, because how many times have we clicked the wrong, from our address book, grab the wrong, and that person maybe is their acquaintance of that, or you type the name wrong, and they get this, because you don't have
I can tell you CASL Cure will catch that.
Even if they make a mistake or whatever.
Yes, it will.
Okay, that's. But what is actually, when you really go through the whole thing, and I think what the comment you heard, which I think is correct, that this is a lot bigger deal than people realize. It may look very simple, straightforward, like you said, but there's a hell of a lot of work involved. I don't know if everybody's actually doing it or realize, but the fact that now I, as an individual, have the right to sue, private right to sue, I don't have to worry about it because the law is clearly there.
It's the sender's onus.
Is a sender's, so correct. So I can turn and sue the heck out of somebody and saying, you've been sending me 40 emails, I've told you. Like, I have a situation where I unsubscribe, but it keeps coming back. It's not like to the type of example you give. So
the challenges are going to be these that your application, we'll say that in your application, who gets this alert, and they, because they're, you know, upset at that time, it's, oh, it didn't have the,
Unsubscribe.
had the unsubscribe, thing, and the, whatever else in the address bar.
So the question here is, you get alerts, we all get alerts for system, software, whatever, that could qualify under this.
They absolutely do.
They do, right?
There are certain exemptions, and again, you'd have to read the law or talk to a lawyer and you're very specific, but health and safety, things like that are not, don't fall under. So there's exemptions for that sort of stuff. But your day-to-day marketing alert, so the sales coming or, you know, whatever, that would definitely fall.
So,
More,
here's an example.
Alerts is,
But here's an example. If Microsoft was sending out the upgrade to Windows 10,
Yeah.
and I tried to cut it out umpteen times, and it wouldn't go away. Would that get caught in this?
Yeah, software upgrades that are unsolicited or without consent are not allowed.
Yeah, because it said, and I said, no thanks, don't remind me again. And yet it kept coming, in fact, it was like almost like a virus, right?
Well, so, I think it's one of the issues that this thing, I believe, CASL will probably catch, the fact that Microsoft doesn't, it's not just implied, but it's something, or installing something to update Microsoft.
Yeah.
itself. So I'm thinking that this will also capture those instances as well,
So-
in which you have to drastically change the whole process of how you install information into your systems or anything.
So the comment here is that, like Microsoft or whoever, when the upgrades are coming, is not just implied consent. You actually need to get a very specific consent for this.
Yeah.
So,
And express consent needs to be given expressly by definition, but what some companies tried to do or thought they could do is say, tick a box if you don't want to receive something or whatever. You have to actively say you do. So a common way of acquiring express consent is during the customer onboarding, if your business has that sort
Right.
of thing, a customer onboarding, is to say, just to add, yes, I give my express consent to receive email for whatever purpose. And then once you've acquired that, express consent is perpetual, it doesn't go away unless they unsubscribe, whereas implied consent has all these various timeframes, starting with the 2 years and working backwards to shorter periods for different types of implied consent.
so this is actually going to make things very interesting,
Yeah.
actually.
I was going to come back to this,
The-
you know, unsubscribe, that's one of the marketing,
Software
alerts.
upgrade.
I know it's, application alerts, is like, you know, an application runs and something happens and it has to inform the appropriate people that something went wrong, you better, you know, take a look at that. Well, that message going out, it may not always go out, you know, internally, it may go to, you know, an external, you know, party, because they may, if that external party is having a bad day, is upset at you, they can, because it doesn't have consent, you're now looking at, you know, a large, you know,
So here's, hopefully, some more questions will come from people in the audience, but when you see, as a city, do you see challenges of?
Oh, yeah, of course. One of
You
the
might
things
want to
is,
come here and speak a little louder.
I'm not familiar with the law is, you had mentioned that there are certain exemptions, and could fall under this law. But what about with respect to, say, potential, say, security risk? As an example, I have various vendors that actually send me commercial message of that nature because there is a security issue in their product. Would that be exempt or would that fall under CASL?
Again, you'd have to maybe look at the terms and conditions, although based on the fact that they're a vendor and you've had a commercial relationship with them, there should be implied consent.
Sure, should be.
So although if you haven't transacted in over 2 years, that could have expired.
Right.
So
Okay.
I can't give you a precise answer without knowing the precise parameters. The reason they defined implied consent was that, yeah, sure, we're doing business, we can contact you. But when they do, there should be an unsubscribe as well, unless there's health and safety or that sort of stuff.
Just to get that, one second, hold 1 second. So basically the question was, if the city is saying that if there was a vendor situation and they were getting alerts for security or any other reason, could be upgrades too, how does that qualify? And you heard the answer, basically, that all depends on the agreement. So what it means is whatever agreements you got your vendor, where you got the software for the purposes of upgrade, for the purposes of maintenance or whatever, make sure that they are covered so you don't get a surprise. Sorry, now go ahead.
So I'm also thinking about that as well. I'm really curious about the
Louder.
Oh, sorry. I'm really curious with the BVM and iPhone instances because in any organization you're sending emails to internal parties as well as
Well, internal is excluded. When,
Internal.
yeah, you're dealing inside your business, it doesn't fall.
I'm
It's
saying-
external.
I'm saying your footnotes are footnotes. Doesn't matter
Yeah.
where you're sending it to.
So
You
you're-
have to break those footnotes for that outboard. So
Okay.
if you're sending an email to another individual outside your organization, let's say your product offices is sending an email to that organization, that by default falls under that.
Yeah, externally.
So BBM message or iPhone message or any other message, like there are times when we see messages here that come through that I never asked for, and
But sales and focus, it has to be sales and focus.
Commercial electronic message. So if there's anything related to business or the potential to develop business or solicitation of business or discussing business, anything commercial in nature falls under CASL.
So my understanding is by that definition, say it was
Which?
census,
Say it was
a government
Oh, a
census
census,
would be,
yeah.
would be out.
It's funny, the provincial guys that wrote it
Yeah.
exempted themselves,
I see.
but municipal governments are not exempt.
Ah,
So for commercial stuff, so when you're looking at renting a field or renting your facilities or whatever, or doing, anything that's got a commercial angle to it, that falls under CASL at the municipal level.
so
Here's a
in case you guys missed it on the website, because I think it's a pretty important point, that the provincial government is exempt from this requirement when they go to the citizen. However, the cities, the municipalities are not.
I'll just elaborate a
Yes.
funny thing. I don't know if anybody, I know this is recorded, but when I was dealing with my contacts in the CRTC, I was amused to note that none of their emails had an unsubscribe or corporate ID. Now, the unsubscribe I could understand because they're the regulator and they don't want to be able to be unsubscribed from, but they didn't even have the corporate ID, which I thought was a little odd. You'd think they would show the mark.
These are emails that we receive a lot.
Is that a question or comment?
Let's go ahead.
Because of the people on the,
But it's
I'm very worried about.
it's the, and I don't want to say how it applies, are the out of office messages. Because typically right now, they just say, I'm sorry, I'm out of the office,
Yeah.
and that just answers, I'll be back on Monday, and that's all we get. Like, there's no,
But that's
But
usually in response to
that's in
somebody
response to an
emailing you,
email.
right?
but thing is, okay, but still, that's where it's only, if that's just as a response, I guess it doesn't need the unsubscribe. but-
Yeah.
So the question here is what happens if there's an automatic response to basically the out of office type thing, but that's okay because that's actually triggered because you send an email, the person is not there, so that should not be an issue. Even logically that it should be covered. So that, are there any other questions from the people on the web? I mean, you have email of, okay, there's something coming through.
And what I would suggest is you look at the law and the statutes, because certain, like charity organizations, so volunteer is pretty broadly based, but that's the term that was used here.
Yeah.
Most, not all, but almost all charitable foundations are exempt. And I'm guessing that's what you're alluding to with the volunteer, but it might not be. So again, you'd have to look at the statute or look at the actual law, and it can tell you the specific parameters of what's included and what isn't. That's a general question, but if it's charity, in virtually all cases of charities, they're exempt.
They're exempt, I think, yeah,
Yeah.
because we're not a charity, but Canadian Information Processing Society is an association, but it's not for profit,
Yeah.
right? So, in most part, it should be, in fact, exempt.
Yeah.
Should be, right?
Again, the
but
term
we
comes
need
to
to-
commercial if there's anything
Yeah.
commercial about it. Yeah.
Because there, I won't get any more deals from banks for low interest rate. Because I don't. But, so I will go give it one more minute here, if there's because I think you covered it pretty broadly, very well in depth, and I think that if people on the web have questions, you certainly have the email address, and we are recording and we'll certainly make it available, and it'll be on the CIPS website as well, but we will send you a link to those who are attending here, so you will have a chance to go over it again, just in case you heard something and missed something. You can always go back to what Neil was talking about with the PowerPoint.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to give a demonstration and an overview of CASL here as a product. Obviously, this is an informational session, but my experience and expertise comes from having developed a solution that is fully automated and integrated and answers all the questions. So if you're interested, please reach out and we can arrange a session.
So from a CIPS standpoint, what I want to do is thank Neil, and one of the key things, even before I go to that part, Canadian Information Processing Society, besides being a professional organization and standards, and we are also about knowledge sharing and making sure that the skills get upgraded, and we do through this type of events that we try and do a couple of times a month, but there are many other things happening. So if there are that Neil did, which I thought was fantastic, because even I can hear people nodding their heads here, can see them, was very good actually. It was very valuable information, and it will help a lot of us, because now we need to go rethink, including us, just to make sure, because I'm taking that role in a few of the places. I'm saying I need to make 100% certain we are covered fully, and we probably are, but we can't take a chance. And the fact that you provided and you're quite happy to do the demo, that's also fantastic. So I know you live very far away, 2-3 hours away, I think it is. So the fact that you've taken time, trouble to come and help us and enlighten us with this, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
That's fantastic. So I think that would be very helpful, and folks on the web, I want to thank each and every one of you, because you've taken time from your busy schedule, perhaps not watching a hockey game with all the new players, or wherever you are, or baseball's gone anyway. But thank you very much for taking time. We really truly appreciate because as more people participate, get involved with us in this type of situation, we can bring you more subjects that are relevant, near and dear to our heart, that helps us all kind of take the skills forward. As I say, in teaching you learn, and learning you teach. So we want to make sure we take that forward. So on behalf of Canadian Information Processing Society and CASL Cure, thank you very much to Neil, and if you're in the office still, drive carefully and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, folks. Good night.